I think the biggest reflection for me this year is, I don't want to dwell on this too much because I think everywhere you look in the press, it's been spoken about. But, you know, we talked a lot about the parallels between the energy transformation and the digital transformation. And we've seen that play out before our very eyes with the AI boom. Next year, they're anticipating a $420 billion market for AI. And this was, just a few years ago, it wasn't even a $100 billion market, predicted to go to 2 trillion by the end of the decade. And so AI is going absolutely bananas. It's infiltrating into everything we do. And it's super exciting. It's going to really help the energy industry, but it's super reliant on the energy industry. And I think these two markets are completely dependent on one another for their long-term success. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Renewable Rides. Today, Dan and I are flying solo, no guests, but a super exciting opportunity to reflect on what's been a very interesting 2024. Dan, at the start of the year, we had some predictions, and it feels like it's a really good time to reflect on some of what we saw in the market and set ourselves up to make some more predictions on a future episode for 2025. So we'd love to dig in with you. In terms of one of our first predictions, I think we don't need to cover them all, but one of our first ones was this is going to be a breakout year for distributed and on-site energy. What do you make of that? How did we do?
Yeah, it was certainly a big year. I think there was a variety of factors driving this. It's been a one where there was a lot of distractions, I'd say, throughout the year as well, which presented some challenges, namely the election and a couple other things. But when I look back on the year as a whole, I mean, it's rather interesting to see. For example, the one of the big drivers has been the just increasing in electricity rates and kind of the staggering growth over the last several years, most notably in the last year. And when we look across the country, there's over half of all the states in the country have seen a 20% or more increase in grid electricity prices since 2020. And if we isolate, for example, here in California, and I know it's an anomaly, just from 2023 to 2024, we saw just under a 25% increase, a 24% increase. And so one of the episodes that we can look back on is episode 64, where we looked at the grid carbon intensity and prices. So let's listen to an excerpt from that. Vermont, Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and even New York all saw increases in their carbon intensity. And the reason that those in particular jumped out at me is because those are often the states that have the most expensive rates. In fact, when we look at 2024 state-by-state rates, according to the EIA, 6 of the top 11 most expensive states saw this increase, which was pretty staggering to me. And so what that made me think about is the companies that we talk to that say, oh, I'm just going to let the grid get greener. And one would think that these maybe more progressive, more democratic, especially as we're in this election cycle, states would be the ones that are decarbonizing the most. And they're going to be the shining examples of grid decarbonization. Yet they're actually getting more carbon intensive. And so we then bring that to what actually gets projects moving forward, Gareth. It's the economics of projects. Always. And so then we start to look at where were the states that had the greatest change over since 2020 in their energy charges. And worst offender right here in our own backyard, California. When you adjust for inflation, which over 2020 to 2024, inflation was roughly 21.5%. Even after adjusting for inflation, California commercial rates went up 41%. Like how we continue to conduct business here is crazy, but at the same time, that's just all the more reason that we see on-site energy systems going in here in California. But then you see New York and Maine increasing 15 and 10%. And so it starts to paint this picture that if you're a business that's trying to decarbonize, on-site energy is a phenomenal pathway for doing so. What were some of the things that stood out for you most, Gareth?
Yeah, I think the raw change in rates absolutely blows my mind. California, 70%, New York, 40, Maine, 35, Massachusetts, 30. And I think we're seeing a lot of activity in those states for those very reasons.
All right. The other area that I thought was particularly interesting was just more and more asset owners starting to realize the opportunity here, the financial opportunity here. We're recently working with a food and beverage distribution and processing company that's developing a new project in Florida, and they're looking at, rates in Florida are relatively low. They're looking at roughly an 8-year payback on deploying an on-site solar system, which historically most companies would not get behind something with an 8-year payback. That's a bit too long. Now, this particular company does have a much more long-term view, and they're excited about the project and they're proceeding forward. So I think just like kind of the general ethos, and it varies by company, they're seeing the other stackable benefits beyond just purely financial benefits of these systems, which is going to continue to drive adoption. The other area that it makes me think of when we look at kind of landlords versus tenants is just the large real estate asset owners realizing that it's a bit of their fiduciary responsibility to start exploring and adopting on-site energy systems. And it makes me think back to episode 60, where we interviewed Brendan McCarthy from Calvert Research, and he talked a lot about the fiduciary responsibility of asset owners. Let's listen to that excerpt now.
Absolutely. I think there's kind of a growing bifurcation, let's say. And so you can put your head in the sand and ignore it, and you will end up with stranded assets, and you will face higher financing costs, lower leasing rates, less leasing traffic, etc. Or you can embrace the risks and opportunities. You can work to mitigate the risks and seize on the opportunities and generate superior assets that command premium rents, have lower financing costs, and increased leasing traffic.
So the last thing that I'll say on it being a breakout year is we did take a look towards the end of the year on the Solar Energy Industries Association's Solar Means Business Report. And from their 2022 report, the previous 5 years, so from 2017 to 2022, the compound annual growth rate of on-site solar was just 3%. But in the 5 years from 2019 to 2024, that growth rate jumped to 12%. So we're seeing a significant uptick, and largely that's been in the last couple of years since the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act. So I think we're going to continue to see that trend go. Well, let's move on to the next prediction that we had at the beginning of the year, which was really around the ramping up of EV deployments and electrification. Gareth, what did we see in 2024 on that front?
Yeah, we predicted that we were going to step change away from it being a bit of a niche market to being more mass adopted. And I think it's been quite an exciting year on that front. I think there's a lot of people who believe that the industry's stalled out and it's not going to go anywhere, but the stats completely differ. According to Kelley Blue Book's latest analysis on the market, the US market grew by 11% year on year through the third quarter of 2024. So this is the latest data. And according to the latest counts, an estimated 346,000 EVs were sold in Q3 of 2024. And that's a 5% increase over Q2. And the EV share of sales was 9%. So for every car being bought right now, 9% of them are electric vehicles, which is absolutely incredible. And I think this is becoming more of an emotional battle rather than a technical one. The cars are getting better and better. People are realizing that this isn't just a green thing to do. This is actually a pleasure perspective. It's a enjoyment factor. It's practical. And I think the stats that we saw earlier in the year is like charging your car is the equivalent to paying $1 per gallon for fuel, even in the most expensive states. And so when you think about the actual operating costs of these things, as well as not really having to maintain the vehicles, I think more and more people are realizing the short and long-term benefits. And so I think the ongoing infrastructure questions are going to continue to remain. Like, how do we deploy more EV chargers without maxing out the grid? How do we ensure that we support the grid to deal with this flexible and variable load demand? And I think these are all exciting problems for us to solve. I think most people are realizing that they only drive their cars to and from the work or the grocery store. And so you don't need a 400 plus mile range. And so I think a lot of these kind of preconceived misconceptions and frustrations are being knocked over. And I think that's really unlocking the market. And particularly we're seeing price points for these vehicles coming down and more models coming into the market, which provides a lot of choice. So super excited to see where this market's going. And it was really awesome to chat with Kristen from General Motors and hear their thoughts on how the EV rollout is going and their responsibility in the industry. So let's check that out.
I'm not one to shy away from being part of the solution for anything. Neither is, our company as a whole. And certainly we have things that we control, and then there's things that we can influence. And so, if we look at, again, our carbon footprint, the part we control is rather small, of our own facilities. You can argue we control the EV transition, but clearly that's a market-driven thing as well. But we've said all along, we can't do this by ourselves. We want to be part of the solution. So GM's been part of a number of partnerships around charging infrastructure, whether it be from a policy standpoint or the, a great example is the pilot and Flying J facilities that you're starting to see across the major thoroughfares in the U.S., which will, make charging more readily available as people are on, more longer trips. And so I think we've got to continue. We do a lot of work with other companies and organizations on things like the Clean Energies Buyer Alliance or CEBA, where, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, other companies are part of that as well, that are not only finding ways to make the renewable energy transition happen faster, whether it be from permitting or processes, but working together on ways to look at what the future is going to be with, we're going to have a large car park of EVs that are frankly energy devices that can help with, grid reliability and providing backup power. So we really are focused on it holistically, certainly on what we control, but then on what we can influence and what's really important for the total transition to occur.
Dan, our next prediction was that energy control and resilience was going to be a key factor this year. What do we see?
Certainly, it was quite the year actually, and I think more and more companies are understanding the value of resilience or placing a value on resilience. Unfortunately, earlier in the year, we had two pretty severe hurricanes make landfall across the U.S., creating some pretty devastating impacts, and so that amplified the need. But one of the things that we've seen in working with some of our customers is not just thinking about outages, but also thinking about the impacts that just things like voltage sags can have. For those of our listeners that aren't too familiar, voltage within the grid needs to remain relatively constant, and if you have sags, many businesses can see a bit of a dim in the lights, and it doesn't really impact things. But certainly manufacturers that have some somewhat fickle equipment that is sensitive to these types of voltage sags, it can wreak havoc. So, for example, we did some work with a customer who had identified that at one of their plants, voltage sags were creating $9 million worth of losses on an annual basis. And on top of that, outages were creating on the order of $2.5 million of losses on an annual basis. That's significant. And those are only things that you can solve with on-site systems. And through looking at the opportunity that they had there, they could look at deploying uninterruptible power systems and power quality and power conditioning hardware, and see a sub 1 year payback on deploying these types of systems, which is just, I mean, tremendous for a business, and it helps their yield of their production, and it's just something that can't be overlooked. And as we see the grid aging, we're going to continue to see more of this. The other thing that I thought was interesting, we touched on the episode of where would you want to be in a major hurricane, and the answer there was Disney. Disney has done a great job of adopting these types of technologies, and really wanting to be on the forefront of how do we not just create the happiest place on earth, but in some cases the safest place when it comes to some of these major events. And so let's reflect back on episode 59, where we hit on all the measures that Disney has been putting in place. And it's important for business leaders to remember that the only way you can truly be resilient in one of these outage situations, whether it's a hurricane, a wildfire, a squirrel running into a transformer, is to have on-site power generation and storage. And so, Gareth, how should a business leader be thinking about this?
Well, I think it's a really good question, Dan. I think the first thing is to actually think about it before it happens. I think the biggest issue we see today for many companies is that they only think about resilience once the power is gone, and then they're in a scramble state trying to recover operations. And that's definitely not where you want to be. And so, we have insurance policies for many aspects of our business. And I think this is actually one of the most profitable insurance policies you could ever have for your business, whereby, you can invest in a system that can support you during times of need. But when you're not using it in those times of need, it's actually reducing your operating costs, increasing your profits, reducing your emissions, and creating all these additional benefits, which many of us do not gain from paying into insurance premiums typically. So I think a really powerful opportunity.
All right. Well, beyond resilience and power quality concerns, one thing that continues to come up is supply chains, and our predictions were that the supply chains were going to be more stable and more predictable. How'd that play out, Gareth?
It played out to a T, Dan. I think we did really well on this one. I think the reality is we all saw how screwed up our supply chains got post or during COVID, and then it got even more complicated by conflicts around the world. But I think the industry's done a really good job of getting on top of that. And I just want to share some interesting stats around the prices of solar and batteries. So solar panel prices, so this is US cents per watt. Back in 2020 in the US, we were looking at 41 cents a watt. And then it kind of dropped all the way down to a little over 30 cents at the back end of 2021, but then through kind of the COVID period, really crept back up to in the 38, 39 cents range. And then since we've seen, from the middle of 2023 through to now, it really dropped back down to 31 cents. So we're now, at the lowest it's been in the last 5 years, the lowest it's ever been. And this is in the US. Globally, we saw prices go from 22 cents in 2020. They spiked through COVID as high as 28 cents. And now they've dropped all the way down to 11 cents. So that really shows that the supply chains have caught up, and we're seeing continual benefits of producing more of these products and the price coming down across the board. On the battery side, back in 2013, the prices of lithium ion batteries, and this is US dollars per kilowatt hour, was $806. And then it dropped all the way down to $155 in 2021. Through COVID, it spiked up to $166, so it grew a bit. And then since, we've seen it drop all the way down to $115. So massive cost reductions with a slight blip through COVID, but amazing success stories to see both the cost of these technologies and the supply chains being really unlocked. And I think the reality is, under the new administration, I think we also had some predictions around sort of country and energy sovereignty, and also, a big part of that is the supply of critical minerals and metals. And I think we're going to continue to see a lot more focus on how do we get control over those resources such that we're not completely reliant on external parties. So I think continue to look out for that. I think that didn't quite come up as much as what we expected through this year. And I think that was primarily because it wasn't a central focal point of the election per se, but I think it will be for this administration. And it's super awesome to actually talk about this with Peter Kelly Detweiler just recently. He's talking about the prices of steel, as well as some of the supply chain challenges around some of the major energy equipment. And I think this will continue to reinforce why distributed and on-site energy will pick up momentum, where we can rely on panels and batteries and generators, which are more available, versus at a utility scale. Some of the big equipment like transformers, they've still got 3, 5, 7-year supply chain delays or back orders. And so trying to get access to some of that equipment is going to be super hard, particularly when you think about where you can source it from. And he raised some of the concerns from a cyber perspective of buying some of this equipment from the likes of China and having to now find other alternatives or reshore that manufacturing to the US. So very interesting topic, and I think one that's going to continue to build a momentum. But let's check out that conversation with Peter from episode 68.
But when we look at the age of a lot of the grid infrastructure, large grid transformers being far past their expected useful life. So what challenges is this new load growth going to present in the coming years, and how is it going to impact businesses?
Yeah, so let's start with the transformers and also the lines. Your transformers need special grain steel, and there's very limited supply of that. And in fact, right now, there's about a 3-year wait for transformers, and switchgears pretty high wait too. In fact, some housing developers can't put in new developments in certain parts of the country, let alone, businesses, right? So that's been a concern. And we also import about $4 billion a year of transformers from China, last I looked, which is about 2 weeks ago.
And Dan, I think the last kind of major reflections we had in terms of our predictions were around regulations and incentives, and both of these playing critical roles in the energy transformation throughout 2024. How did that play out?
Yeah, it was an interesting year, and I think one on the regulation side, there's been a handful of regulations that have been outlined over the last several years across building performance standards and other kind of emissions related or decarbonization related regulations, but they've largely been the guidelines associated with them as far as benchmarking and then starting to put together your plans. But we've just started seeing this year the fines starting to impact businesses. And I was just speaking with a customer the other day who is very eager to deploy an on-site energy system, an on-site solar system, to avoid the tens of thousands of dollars of fines that they're experiencing. And that was related to the WARE program here in Southern California. The WARE program was related to the amount of truck traffic coming in and out of warehouses, and one of the mitigation measures that companies can do to avoid some of these fines is to deploy on-site solar. And now that these fines are being incurred, they're looking for ways to avoid them and not have that capital go elsewhere, but go into their own existing assets. So let's reflect back on episode 62, where we hit on that WARE program. And unlike businesses that are maybe a bit more, have the ability to be a bit more mobile, whether they're professional services or other businesses, those that own or occupy large commercial real estate properties can't really move. You can't pick up a building and move it somewhere else. So you are at the mercy of the local carrots and sticks, if you will, or regulations and incentives. And so one of those that has been gaining a lot of momentum over the last really 10 years, but much more so over the last, say, 3 or 4 years, has been this concept of building performance standards or building energy performance standards. And really what these are, they're becoming increasingly common in cities, so enacted by cities, but also we're starting to see them in states. And what they are is really focused on addressing the carbon impact of the built environment. And they're often written in such ways that they are more outcome-based rather than the measures or tactics taken to reach those outcomes. And so they're typically structured in a way where they set a baseline year of emissions for a particular property or a standard for that type of property, and then set targets in future years of how much carbon emissions or energy use intensity these buildings need to reach. And if they don't, then they start to face fines. And in some cases, the fines can be somewhat nominal, and in other cases, they can be rather impactful for non-compliance. So the other area within regulations and incentives that I think is worth noting on, we talked quite a bit about the Inflation Reduction Act, and then there's also another area that continues to be very, very interesting, which are different grant programs. We saw in one of our customers recently, specifically the USDA REAP grant program, which rural facilities can qualify for. Staggeringly, when you stack the REAP grant with the tax credits, with some of the accelerated depreciation incentives, this customer is going to be able to get an on-site energy system for nothing. They're legitimately not going to pay anything for this energy system, which, when you think about it, is why not? They're going to get these amazing benefits. This particular customer was looking at how they can charge a fleet of electric vehicles, where the utility was telling them that they were going to have to spend $1 million to upgrade infrastructure to get the power needed to charge these vehicles. Now they're taking that money, and what they thought was going to be putting it into their own assets and building their own systems, which they are, but they're actually not going to have to spend any money at all, given all these incentives. So I think that's a particularly interesting one. As we look at an episode that we recorded, we did look in episode 63 in our post-election reflection. We talked a bit about the Inflation Reduction Act and the potential for changes coming to that. And a lot of the news and chatter that's been coming out of the Capitol since then, I think there are probably going to be some changes, but the changes to the tax credits are from all the predictions I've been reading, going to be nothing or minimal. So let's look back at episode 63 and our conversation on the Inflation Reduction Act and the tax credits associated with that. What are some of the statistics that were driven by the Inflation Reduction Act? And when you dig into it, it's actually rather interesting. There's been over 271 there has been 271 manufacturing projects for clean energy technologies and electric vehicles announced since the passing of the IRA. And collectively, if they're all completed, that's over 100,000 jobs. And regardless of political leaning, jobs are jobs, and everybody can get behind that. And these are great long-term jobs. The other thing that I found that was interesting was that the actual investment has totaled $89 billion, which is an increase of 305% compared to the 2 years prior. And I found in a different MIT study that when you look at the actual investment on a state-by-state basis as a percentage of state GDP, and this is for the time period, the year of 2 years of Q3 2022 through the second quarter of this year, 2024, the top 10 states, again, on the manufacturing investment as a percentage of state GDP, in order, it's Tennessee, Kentucky, Nevada, Michigan, Kansas, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Ohio, and Indiana. And that's pretty awesome to see. And these are traditional blue collar states that have a lot of manufacturing, and it's exciting to see more manufacturing come back. So when the concerns over, my perspective, the concerns over the IRA just simply going away, I'm not too concerned about that. All right. Whew. We there was quite a few other predictions that we made at the beginning of the year. We won't hit on some of those, but Gareth, I mean, beyond the predictions that we had at the beginning of the year, any other reflections just generally on the market and what we've seen?
Yeah, well, I think just to round out your conversation there, Dan, about the regulations and incentives, I think, in terms of this market being unlocked, I think a lot of businesses were on the sideline waiting for clarity. And I think with the election now behind us, that's really going to help. Regardless of which way it went, I think businesses just wanted to know what the landscape was going to look like for the next few years. So I think that's super important. And I think there's been elections all around the world. And so I think globally, we're going to maybe see a bit more of a settled landscape, especially in 2025, so businesses can operate with confidence. I think the biggest reflection for me this year is, I don't want to dwell on this too much because I think everywhere you look in the press, it's being spoken about. But, we talked a lot about the parallels between the energy transformation and the digital transformation. And we've seen that play out before our very eyes with the AI boom. Next year, they're anticipating a $420 billion market for AI. And this was, just a few years ago, it wasn't even a $100 billion market, predicted to go to $2 trillion by the end of the decade. And so AI is going absolutely bananas. It's infiltrating into everything we do. And it's super exciting. It's going to really help the energy industry, but it's super reliant on the energy industry. And I think these two markets are completely dependent on one another for their long-term success. And I think a real great example of an aspect of the digital transformation is cryptocurrencies. And while we didn't want to offer investment advice at the start of the year, we did say, as a result of crypto ETFs becoming available and the Bitcoin halving event happening, and also some clarity around the regulations, which I'm seeing, the new administration really doubling down on in terms of their SEC appointment, as well as their very pro-crypto stance. The value of crypto this year went from $40,000-ish per Bitcoin to over 100,000. So I wish we'd have listened to our own advice and doubled down even more than maybe we did. But I think it's just highlighting that there's lots of exciting things going on across the market. And everything comes back to being reliant on energy in order to power these things. So how do we get more energy quicker, more flexibly, more affordably, more reliably, more sustainably? These are going to continue to be mega trends and very exciting times. How about you? Any big reflections as you think about 2024 as a whole?
I'm primarily reflecting back on the conversations we had with large corporates and leaders within large enterprises. And the thing that continues to come back to me is that when making energy decisions, and let's isolate it down a bit further to deployment of on-site energy systems, we have to remind ourselves that these are large infrastructure decisions, whether they're making a capital purchase or they're looking to sign a long-term energy as a service or power purchase agreement. These are large infrastructure decisions, and that means that there's a lot of people involved in that process. These are largely kind of decisions by committee, if you will. But the thing that continues to present itself is that at any point along that chain, anybody could say no to a project. Nobody can alone say yes to a project. It requires a whole group, but any one of them could kill a project. And so what that means is the more of a need for education, hence the reason we do this podcast, to help highlight what people are doing, what the opportunities are, what the challenges are, how people can be aware, but also the reality that different people within an organization have different motivations and have different things that are important to them. And so understanding that any of these projects has a variety of key aspects to it and reasons why you should do it, it's important to convey that information to people in the things that are important to them, which is exactly what we tackle every day at VECKTA. And so I think that just continues to be a good reminder, is that again, I'll double down on the point that anybody can say no, not one person can say yes. And so how do we overcome any objections from folks along the way to ensure that great projects get done? And also recognizing that there's a lot of projects that should never get done, and how do we avoid spending wasted time and resources on those projects? So that's been a big reflection. I know that's going to continue into the new year, but I think it's one of the biggest pieces to help unlock this entire market. And the more we can get people on board and understanding the realities and the challenges and how to overcome those, the more we can do together as an industry.
Yeah. And it's been awesome actually having front row seats for that, hasn't it been, Dan? I think, speaking with major corporations all around the world every day, like we're seeing that tide change, aren't we? And we're seeing the interest and the excitement and the adoption and the early deployments and some of the big boys, that we've talked about throughout this year, the Walmarts, the Targets, the Lineage Logistics, seeing huge returns on investment, which is now making everyone else pay attention in order for them to be, one, competitive, and two, resilient into the future. And so it's great to see firsthand that interest, but also to be hearing the frustrations and the challenges to that adoption. I think it was a big part of why we wanted to do that Pain Point series. And I think we'll continue to share the perceived challenges and blockages and how we continue to knock them down one by one as an industry and come together to ensure that every project is a good project and there's no black eyes that prevent further adoption. So, yeah, awesome.
Certainly. And thank you to all our listeners. And thank you for those that have reached out and shared feedback, shared topics. Please continue to do so. We do this for you to help you understand how we go about this together. And here's to an amazing 2025. We'll come out with our 2025 predictions here shortly. But Gareth, thank you for being an awesome co-host, and I'm excited to continue this as we move into the new year.
It's been a pleasure. It's highlight of every week, getting to hang out with you, chat about what's going on in the market, and like you say, keep the feedback coming. We're always looking to improve. What are the topics on your minds? How can we help you go up the learning curve and stay clued into this market at scale? Let's go.
Beautiful. Cheers.
We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible, and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks, and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs, and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself, and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.